an item that you're here for, which is the Inspector General item. Raul has now joined us, and I know that you want to maybe tee this up, the Inspector General discussion? And I know, Commissioner Samuel, and this is important to you as well, as it is to all of us.
Thank you, Commissioner. As you know, we were previously before the Finance Committee with regard to the creation of a potential Inspector General office and making that office and the Inspector General an independent charter officer, much like the city manager, the city attorney, and the city clerk. What we have for you in this ongoing item today is the proposed draft ordinance, which sets forth the powers and duties of the Inspector General, as well as the selection process, budget, and other pertinent terms, as well as the proposed ballot question and charter text amendment that we've prepared, which, pursuant to the Commission's recommendation, will be placed, if approved by the Commission, will be placed on the ballot in November 2018. So the ballot question that I prepared here will be brought to the City Commission at its July meeting, because that's the earliest date that the county will allow us to start approving questions for the November ballot. At that time, if the Commission approves the placement on the ballot, it will go before the voters in the November 6, 2018 election. And if the voters approve the creation of the Office of the Inspector General, then our plan is to bring the proposed ordinance, which formalizes the specifics of the powers and duties, the budget, the scope, et cetera, to the Commission at its December meeting for 2 readings, December and January. And then if that ordinance passes, the Commission can proceed with creating the selection committee, which is prescribed by ordinance, and go through the selection process. So if everything goes according to schedule and the Inspector General position is approved and the ordinance approved and the selection process goes forward, we should have an Inspector General office in place by February or March. Today, what I'm prepared to do is go through the draft ordinance that is in your addendum material number 1, and of course, answer any questions or incorporate any comments you may have. So what the charter question would do is generally create the office of an Inspector General. And that charter question, what the charter text says is that the office is created by charter. It's an independent office, as I said, like the city attorney, city clerk, and city manager, and its powers and duties would be prescribed by the ordinance before you. What I want to emphasize here is that what we're doing here by placing the position in the charter is not only are we making our Inspector General truly independent, but in the future, the position could only be abolished by referendum. So this is, I just want to make clear that unlike other current positions that we have in the code that report to the manager, like the auditor, the city auditor, this would be an independent office which reports directly to the City Commission and whose Inspector General is hired and fired by the City Commission, number 1. So in preparing the ordinance, we have had several meetings with the Miami-Dade County Office of the Inspector General. And what our ordinance is largely based on the county's ordinance, except, as I said, we took it one step further, and we want to memorialize this position in the city charter so that it can't simply, so that if a future commission decides that it doesn't want an Office of Inspector General for whatever reason, it can't simply be done away with by repeal of an ordinance. It has to go to the voters. What the County Inspector General did, and they were fantastic, the manager and I and Mr. Kalergis met with them. They offered suggestions that they would have proffered to improve their current ordinance for their Inspector General. And another reason why we're doing our own Inspector General office is because the Miami-Dade County Inspector General does not have jurisdiction over any municipality in Miami-Dade County. So they don't police the municipalities. They don't do anything with regard to the municipalities, unlike the Ethics Commission, which does have jurisdiction. So we're probably going to be the first municipality in Miami-Dade County that is creating its own Inspector General, which will have jurisdiction over employees and elected officials in the city of Miami Beach. What we envision is, and I'm just going to go through the ordinance, that the minimum qualifications, appointment and term of office for our Inspector General would be, we envision someone with at least 10 years of cumulative experience in any one of the following fields: federal, state, or local law enforcement, federal or state court judge, federal, state, or local government attorney, and/or progressive supervisory experience in an investigative public agency similar to an Inspector General's office. For example, the current Inspector General in Miami-Dade is a former U.S. attorney, so they have prosecutorial experience. The appointment of the Inspector General will be pursuant to a selection committee that will make an advisory recommendation to the City Commission. And the 7-member committee that we have identified would include the State Attorney for Miami-Dade County, Ms. Fernandez-Rundle, the current Miami-Dade County Inspector General, Mary Cagle, the Chairperson of the Miami-Dade Commission on Ethics and Public Trust, myself, the Chairperson of the City's Audit Committee, which I believe is currently Mr. Starkman. No, whoever the Chairperson of the City's Audit Committee is. Your Budget Committee, Mr. Starkman, forgive me. An attorney licensed to practice law and the state attorney with at least 5 years of experience representing local government, who shall be appointed by the commission, and another, a citizen at large, who shall be a resident of Miami Beach and shall also be appointed by the Miami Beach City Commission. So this selection committee will meet to consider the qualifications of the OIG and weed out the candidates, interview the finalists, and make a recommendation with regard to the City Commission. That certainly would not preclude the City Commission, as it has done in previous instances, where it's hired, for example, with the selection of the city manager, or to ask the committee to present a finalist for the position. And at that point, certainly something I envision would that the finalists could meet with the individual city commissioners prior to a final selection made. But the selection committee will gather to receive the recommendations, go through them, and present the best candidates for recommendation to the City Commission. The final selection will be made by the City Commission. Let's talk, and then my office will negotiate a contract with a 4-year term, which is the same term that they have in the county for the OIG. Let's talk about, for those of you that may not know, what an Inspector General does. As I said, an Inspector General is an independent authority. So the Inspector General does not report to the city manager or to myself. They are an independent body. They report to the City Commission. The idea of an Inspector General is to identify and prevent fraud, waste, corruption, mismanagement, and inefficiency in government. So some of the things they do, for example, are they have the authority to make independent investigations and conduct audits and reviews with regard to any city programs, accounts, records, contracts, and transactions. So, for example, They have the ability to independently audit particular city contracts, or upon receipt of a complaint, whether the complaint is from the city commission or whether the complaint is by a member of the public at large, to independently investigate a city contract or a city program. They can also be directed by this body to audit, investigate a city contract or program. So one of the things that I know was important to this commission was making sure that the creation of the Office of the Inspector General travels in a parallel path with the proposed 2018 GO bond issuance that will go to the voters in November 2018 on the same ballot. So, for example, the Inspector General's office could monitor the procurements for the GO bonds, should the GO bonds pass, the contracts and the programs that are approved pursuant to the GO bonds. They have broad investigative powers. Now, they also investigate criminal behavior and ethical behavior. When they do that, and because obviously the resources of an Inspector General are subject to budgetary approval by the City Commission, and so with matters regarding criminal conduct of an employee or an elected official, or ethical conduct of an employee or elected official, the Inspector General, like in Miami-Dade County, would coordinate and work with, respectively, the State Attorney's Office, Kathy Fernandez-Rundle's office, or the Miami-Dade County Commission on Ethics. So, with regard to investigation of city programs, contracts, procurements, the Inspector General would work on its own. The budget of the Inspector General is subject to approval of the City Commission as part of its annual budget process, as is the determination on where to locate the Inspector General. What we envision, for example, if we get an Inspector General, if everything goes successfully and the voters elect to create the office and the ordinance is approved by the City Commission, and we get an Inspector General on board for, let's say, March of next year, of 2019, then funding would have to be identified for that office from March to September 30th. And after that, it would go pursuant to the budget process. We have met with Mr. Woodruff and our budget officer to determine what is an appropriate recommendation for funding. The office that we envision initially would involve, and of course this is up to the City Commission and to budgetary allocation, but would involve, of course, the Inspector General, who would lead the office, an assistant who would probably have some would work in some legal capacity, one investigator, and two clerical positions. So we envision to begin with an office of 5. Miami-Dade County has, to police the entire county, has an office of 11. So it is. There are budgetary considerations, but I think that might be what we have made our recommendations on now, and what Mr. Woodruff and budget would be placing their assumptions on. The remaining budgetary considerations would be the manager's office, of course, decides, and I'm sure with input from the commission, where to situate the Inspector General in Miami Beach, as well as whatever equipment they need. Just so you know also, going forward, if the Inspector General, is investigating a particular program or contract or procurement that requires particular expertise, he or she does have the ability to contract, whether it be with, for additional support, whether it be with Miami-Dade County, or to retain other experts, subject to city procurement and to commission approval for that. Again, the other points I want to make is that the Inspector General will also be annually prepare and submit to the City Commission concerning a written report concerning the work and activities that the office has done, including statistical information regarding the disposition of its investigations, audits, and other reviews. The Inspector General may only be removed upon an affirmative vote of 5/7 vote of the City Commission, and if that happens, the selection process prescribed in the ordinance would start over again. In accordance with the directive that we received when we were working on this ordinance and recommendations from the county, an amendment of the ordinance which sets forth the powers and duties of the Inspector General, anything that reduces the powers and duties of the Inspector General with regard to the ordinance would also require 5/7 vote of the Commission. So the ordinance before you, if there's any comments or questions you have on it, I would appreciate those sooner than later, because once we adopt this ordinance, we can only dilute it through 5/7 vote. And I want to repeat again, if a future commission ever decides to abolish the office, since it's in the charter, that can only be done by referendum.
Okay, so first of all, that was amazing work and a really eloquent and well-reasoned presentation.
Thank you, and I really want to single out, number one, Nick Kalergis. We also, Jimmy was also present when we did the meetings with the county Inspector General, and my individual briefings with you. You've all been very supportive of moving forward with this, so thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, we know you didn't do the work. We know it was your staff, but no, great. I mean,
Thank you. I know.
No, I know you've been working really hard.
Thank you very much. I know.
It shows the quality and level of
Thank you,
the
sir.
effort that went into this. So thank you for teeing this up for us. I had a lot of questions, and every time you spoke, you addressed all of them. I guess my global question is, do we have a fiscal impact on what this might cost? Is this one person, or is it going to be a staff? So I'd like to understand the budgetary impact of this, and you may not have the answer yet. The hiring and firing, I think you were clear on. So I really don't have any questions. I see a lot. The only question I have is this really a full-time job? Because, as you outlined the job description of the office, certainly, to give the public the confidence that procurements and, any concerns that people have around contracts and things, they can go to the Inspector General, which is independent of the city manager. But, bad stuff is not constantly happening. So is this a 40-hour-a-week job? Because it will have a fiscal impact on us, and I don't want somebody sitting in their office twiddling their thumbs. So have we thought about that?
Yes, sir, and that's
We
that's
already
really,
have a mayor who sits around twiddling
right,
his thumbs all day.
exactly.
So
That's a really good question, because we envision all the positions, and really, you also hit upon another good question, Mr. Chairman. This is our recommendation, but this is all subject to budgetary allocation from the City Commission. And I know Mr. Woodruff and Tamika Stewart, are working on that. One thing I also wanted to point out with regard to budget is, as we go forward, I think that the biggest challenge is going to be finding funding for the moment when the Inspector General gets appointed to the conclusion of that budget year. But I know that the other things that we can do, that the county does to offset the cost of the Inspector General, is the county has provisions in certain of their contracts where, similar to our art and public places, for example, 0.05% of certain county contracts, like with vendors, service agreements, management agreements, go towards supporting the Office of the Inspector General. Because, so we hope to offset costs going forward by doing the same thing. The positions that we've recommended are, that's our recommendation. Again, I want to stress that that's going to be part of your budget review. In terms of this being a full-time position, I know in the county that, with an 11-member office, their resources are pretty stretched, and everybody there is full-time, and we envision this this to be full-time, because another point I want to bring up is the Inspector General is not just there to detect bad stuff. The idea of an independent Inspector General, and a lot of what they do in the county, and I'd be glad to circulate for anybody that wants from the public the County Inspector General's annual report, which is very educational, is they sit in on procurements. So in other words, they get involved in high-level procurements to identify potential issues that could be problematic going forward and hopefully avoid those issues. They monitor contracts for compliance, and they also at the request of the city commission, of the commission or of the public, get involved in auditing functions and a lot of things that don't have to do with criminal conduct or ethical conduct, although that certainly is also a part of their responsibility. So I think a lot of the full-time work, for example, at least from what I've been hearing, will be they're going to be very busy, I think, with getting involved in the GEO bonds and working with our administration, our procurement department, as those projects move forward, if the GEO bond issuance pass. And I think it gives a level of comfort to the public. I know that in speaking to the county, when I spoke to the Inspector General, because you would think one of the questions that you would ask is that, you know, how does city staff, or how do I feel, or how do, to feel about having an independent authority that's looking over our shoulder? And surprisingly, the question I got from the Inspector General and a lot of county employees was they welcome this, because when they get involved at the beginning in terms of compliance and procurement, their suggestions avoid problems going forward, and they save money. They save time, and it's efficient. So I was surprised to get that answer. So, so I think a lot of the full-time nature of the position, Commissioner Arreola, will be dedicated toward contract audits, compliance, and procurements of these huge projects that we have going on in the city, in addition to fraud, waste, and corruption.
I just want to echo my colleagues' comments. I'm thrilled with where we're at. Congratulations, Raul, to you and your team. This is a game changer. This is all good for the public and for good government. I think the timing of the GEO bond is amazing. We're asking the public to, instill a degree of trust, and we're saying in parallel that we'll have these checks and balances. I think we've struck the right balance in terms of independence. And Ro, you touched on so much, you probably hit this, but importantly, the independent Inspector General would actually have oversight of the Mayor and Commission's office as well.
Yes, sir.
So this is, I think, a very mature statement. So in terms of the economics, which is always near and dear to my heart, with an operating budget approaching $600 million, I have a feeling that the Inspector General can absolutely pay for itself, and that this will be something that will get real value. So my two comments that I would just want to underline, one is in the ballot question and throughout, I'd like us to continue to focus on efficiency. It's not just fraud or malfeasance, it's are we doing it the right way? Can we do it a better way? So I would just like to encourage us to get that theme across, and if that could be incorporated in the final language, I think that would be helpful.
We can do that.
That's great. The second thing relates to Commissioner Arreola's comment about cost. Obviously, cost is driven by headcount, which is driven by organizational focus. Mr. Starkman wrote an email a couple days ago. Perhaps we can allow him a minute or two to try and talk to what work do we need to do to clarify the focus of the IG to drive headcount to cost. But otherwise, I think we're very, very close, and I'm thrilled with where we're at.
Ron, you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak, and I'll just be a couple of minutes, but by the way, I'm really glad to hear we're looking at reserves. As you know, I've been up here a few times on that. So my main message really here today is that as we look at issues of fraud, waste, and abuse, that the emphasis and additional funding be directed mostly toward prevention and early detection of problems as opposed to thinking of it in terms of prosecution of offenders. You know, it's a difference between kind of looking at it from the perspective of a legal perspective versus perspective of more of an operational perspective. I think the majority of the problems the city has had in the past have included things like lapses in the collection of past due payments, for example, on parking impact fees, timely reconciliation of bank accounts, and a small number of city employees who use their positions for self-enrichment. Now, I don't know, I think most of you did have a chance to read my memo, but I think one of the reasons that we've had some of these problems is because, that they could have been prevented if the internal audit staff had been sufficiently, had enough staff to do the kinds of audits that were needed, and very importantly, that the head of internal audit had the leadership skills and the independence that that position should hold. Previously, it was very low in the organization in terms of reporting relationships.
Okay.
So to use an analogy, I think the problem has been not enough policemen on the beat, more so than as not having enough prosecutors and judges on the bench in terms of how problems have arisen. The federal government has both an Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office, and I think most of the resources are directed to the Government Accountability Office, which is responsible for ensuring that taxpayer money is used wisely. The IG gets involved only after potential abuses have been identified, which actually occur much less often, which can occur less often by ensuring that the right controls are in place and there is regular monitoring in place to ensure that they're being adhered to. So, in connection with looking at the ballot in the ordinance, my thought is that that what we need is to look at and do an analysis of where the problems have been in this city, and not just copy, perhaps, or replicate what's been done somewhere else, because we have had our own history, and there are certain areas that have been problems for us, and look at whether or not the resources that we have the resources properly aligned, particularly for budget purposes, between the prevention and detection versus the power to prosecute and investigate, almost more in a legal sense. Now that obviously the ballot issue is on the critical path, but between now and then we can be working on some of these organizational design issues and functional issues. I don't know if those would perhaps even impact the ordinance or the ballot, but that's really my main message, is that that we approach this from the standpoint of the big picture: fraud, waste, and abuse. Yeah. And recognize that we have had resources internally in the past that did some of this.
All right, got the point. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ron. So I would like to, I'm happy to move the item so that we can get to the reality of the item sooner rather than later. And I would like to incorporate some of the suggestions regarding prevention and early detection, so that when it comes
Good
back.
ideas.
All right, so with that, I move.
You move it?
Second.
Second, okay, awesome. Great discussion. Roll again, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to correct the record. Excuse me, the county OIG has 38 employees. So that puts
38 employees?
38 employees. So that puts into perspective what we're asking for.
That's ridiculous,
Which
but-
is 5.
okay.
And can I just make another comment for the benefit of the
What?
public? Can I make another comment,
Yeah.
please? Thank you. This is the first municipality in Miami-Dade County, that really is kind of agreeing to have an independent authority to police itself. And I think that has to be recognized as something groundbreaking. And what Miami-Dade OIG was very happy about was they were hoping that this move by this city commission would encourage other municipalities to do the same. So, I really just have to, applaud not only the city commissioners, but the administration for agreeing to do this voluntarily, because I think this is a very big step in terms of, maintaining transparency and the confidence of the public going forward. So thank you for making this process easy for me.
Good job. Okay.